Have you ever wondered what happens when a single person decides that silence is no longer an option? What unfolds when someone who was never supposed to understand the language of power suddenly begins to read every secret written against their own people? Tonight I want to share with you a story that has been buried beneath coral stone and monsoon rains for almost 2 centuries. A story about a woman named Amina binti Salam, whose fingers were meant only to grind spices and carry water, but who instead learned to trace Arabic letters by candlelight, night after night, until she could read the very documents that recorded how many human beings were sold like sacks of cloves. This is not merely a tale of revenge. This is the account of how one enslaved woman dismantled an empire's most protected secret, exposed the corruption that reached from the Sultan's palace to the ships of European traders, and ignited a fire that would burn through the slave markets of East Africa. If stories like this move you, if you believe that truth buried in darkness deserves to see daylight, subscribe to this channel now, because what you are about to hear will change how you understand resistance, literacy, and the power of a single mind that refused to remain ignorant. Stay with me until the end, because the final revelation will show you something that historians are still arguing about to this day. On the eastern shore of Zanzibar, where the Indian Ocean crashes against black volcanic rock, there stands a crumbling structure that tourists walk past without knowing what happened inside its walls. The coral blocks have turned gray with salt and time. Frangipani trees have pushed through what was once a storage room. Lizards sun themselves on stones that once felt the weight of iron chains. This was the House of Secrets, not a name given by historians, but one whispered by the descendants of those who survived. It was here, in the year 1827, that a young woman named Amina binti Salam worked as a domestic servant for one of the most powerful merchant families in the Omani-controlled island. It was here that she ground cardamom and ginger in a mortar that still sits in a museum in Stone Town. It was here that she learned to read, and it was here that she discovered the ledger. The ledger was not supposed to exist. Sultan Said, the ruler of Zanzibar and Oman, had publicly declared his cooperation with British efforts to limit the slave trade. He had signed treaties. He had accepted gifts from ambassadors. He had smiled at captains who sailed under the Union Jack. But the ledger told a different story. It recorded every enslaved person who passed through the Sultan's private holdings, every bribe paid to customs officials, every ship that sailed in the dead of night carrying human cargo to markets in Arabia, Persia, and the Ottoman territories. Amina found this ledger. Amina read this ledger. And Amina decided that the world would know what was written inside. What followed was not an explosion, but a slow burning, a systematic exposure that would take 18 months to complete. A web of information passed from hand to hand, mouth to ear, until it reached the desk of a British naval captain whose name would later appear in parliamentary records. The consequences would ripple outward like waves from a stone dropped into still water, touching the halls of Westminster, the markets of Muscat, and the shores of Madagascar. But before we speak of consequences, we must speak of beginnings. We must understand the world that created Amina, the forces that shaped her, and the specific cruelties that transformed a household servant into an agent of historical change. The air in Zanzibar carries a particular weight. Visitors from temperate climates describe it as oppressive, a humidity that wraps around the body like wet cloth. But those who have lived there for generations know that the air carries something else too. It carries memory. It carries the accumulated grief of centuries. It carries the voices of the unnamed dead. In 1827, the island was approaching the peak of its terrible prosperity. Estimates suggest that between 40,000 and 50,000 enslaved Africans passed through the Zanzibar market each year. Some were sold to clove plantations on the island itself. Some were shipped north to the Arabian Peninsula. Some disappeared into households across the Indian Ocean world, from Bombay to Baghdad, from Basra to the Comoros Islands. The trade operated in plain sight, yet it was also hidden. The British had extracted promises from the Sultan to limit certain aspects of the commerce. Ships were supposed to be inspected. Certain routes were forbidden. But the promises existed on paper while the trade continued on water. The gap between official declaration and actual practice was filled with bribes, favors, and the kind of deliberate blindness that makes men wealthy. Into this gap stepped Amina binti Salam, a woman who was never supposed to see it, never supposed to understand it, and certainly never supposed to document it for others to read. If you want to follow more cases like this one, stories that shake the foundations of what we thought we knew about history, subscribe to this channel now so you never miss another investigation into the hidden truths of our past. To understand what Amina discovered, you must first understand the world she inhabited. Zanzibar in 1827 was the beating heart of the East African slave trade. The island measured roughly 50 miles long and 20 miles wide, but within this small territory moved a commerce so vast that it shaped the economies of 3 continents. The slave market in Stone Town was not hidden. It occupied a central square near the waterfront, where the smell of cloves from nearby warehouses mixed with the salt wind and something else, something that survivors described as the scent of fear made visible. Enslaved people were displayed on raised platforms, their bodies oiled to make their skin appear healthy, their teeth examined by buyers who squeezed jaws open with the casual efficiency of men inspecting horses. The process of sale followed a ritual pattern. New arrivals from the mainland were first taken to holding cells near the beach, underground chambers carved into the coral rock where the tide would rise twice daily, forcing the captives to stand for hours in salt water that reached their chests. This served a practical purpose. It cleaned wounds. It reduced the visible marks of the overland march. It made the merchandise more presentable. After the cells came the preparation rooms. Here, enslaved people were fed coconut oil and rice to add weight to their frames. Their skin was rubbed with palm butter until it gleamed. Those who had been branded on the march had their scars treated with mixtures designed to reduce their prominence. Young women had their hair braided in styles considered attractive to Omani buyers. Young men were exercised to display their muscles. Then came the market itself. The auctions began in the late afternoon, when the worst heat of the day had passed. Buyers arrived in flowing white robes, attended by servants who carried parasols and fans. The enslaved stood in lines, arranged by age and sex and apparent health. The auctioneer called out starting prices in a sing-song voice that could be heard 3 blocks away. But the public market was only the surface of the trade. Beneath it operated a shadow system, a network of private sales, special auctions, and direct shipments that bypassed all official records. This was where the real money moved. This was where the Sultan's family took their cut. The House of Secrets, where Amina worked, belonged to a man named Hamad bin Mohammed al-Murjebi, a cousin of the Sultan's treasurer. Hamad was not known for cruelty. He was known for efficiency. His household ran with the precision of a machine, if machines had been powered by human misery. 17 enslaved people maintained his compound, cooked his meals, washed his robes, and managed his correspondence. The compound itself occupied nearly half an acre near the waterfront. It was built in the traditional Zanzibari style, with thick coral walls that kept the interior cool. Interior courtyards open to the sky, and elaborately carved wooden doors that announced the status of the owner to all who passed. The main house had 3 floors. The ground floor contained storage rooms and the kitchen. The second floor held the formal reception areas and Hamad's office. The third floor was the private family quarters, where Hamad lived with his wife, his 3 children, and the household servants who attended them. Amina was one of the 3 women who worked in the inner quarters. She had been purchased 6 years earlier from a caravan that had walked from the shores of Lake Tanganyika, a distance of nearly 800 miles. She was approximately 12 years old when she arrived. She did not know her exact age. Her mother had died on the march. Her father had been sold separately in a market near Tabora. She had been given the name Amina by Hamad's wife, who thought her previous name was too difficult to pronounce. Her previous name was Nyamwisa. It meant, the one who brings light in her mother's language. She never told anyone in Zanzibar what it meant. She held it inside herself like a coal that refused to go cold. The household woke before dawn. The call to prayer echoed from the mosque 3 streets away, and within minutes the compound stirred to life. Water had to be drawn from the well in the central courtyard. Fires had to be lit in the kitchen. Bread had to be baked for the morning meal. The family's clothes had to be laid out. The children had to be dressed. Amina's specific duties centered on the preparation of spices. Zanzibar was known as the Spice Island, and wealthy households prided themselves on the complexity of their cuisine. Each morning, Amina sat in a corner of the kitchen with a large stone mortar and a heavy pestle, grinding the day's requirements. Cardamom pods had to be cracked and their seeds extracted. Cloves had to be measured precisely, as too many would overwhelm a dish. Ginger root had to be peeled and pounded to a paste. Cinnamon bark had to be ground to powder. Black pepper had to be crushed to varying degrees of fineness depending on its intended use. The work was repetitive and physically demanding. By midday, Amina's arms ached from the constant motion. The spices stained her fingers yellow and brown and left their scent embedded in her skin. Other household members could identify her by smell alone. She carried cardamom with her like a signature. But the work also granted her a particular kind of access. The spice preparation area was located in a corner of the kitchen that shared a wall with Hamad's ground floor storage rooms. Through this wall, Amina could hear conversations that took place in the storage area. She heard Hamad meeting with ship captains. She heard negotiations over prices. She heard discussions about routes and timing and which customs officials could be trusted. For the first 4 years, she heard these conversations without understanding their full significance. She knew that Hamad was involved in trade. She knew that some of this trade involved human beings, but the details remained vague, an overheard noise rather than comprehensible information. What changed was the arrival of a boy named Faraji. Faraji was purchased in the spring of 1825, approximately 2 years before the events that would make Amina's name echo through history. He was younger than Amina by perhaps 3 or 4 years. He came from a region near Kilwa, on the mainland coast south of Zanzibar. He had been captured in a raid on his village and had spent 6 months in a holding facility before being shipped to the island. Unlike most enslaved people in Hamad's household, Faraji was not assigned to physical labor. He had been identified as exceptionally intelligent, and Hamad decided to train him as a copyist. The Arab trading houses of Zanzibar relied heavily on written records, and skilled copyists who could produce clear, accurate documents were valuable. Hamad saw in Faraji a long-term investment. The training began immediately. Faraji was given to an elderly scribe named Yusuf, who lived in a small room attached to the household compound. Yusuf had served Hamad's family for over 40 years. His hands trembled now, and his eyesight was failing, but his knowledge of Arabic calligraphy remained precise. Every morning, Faraji sat with Yusuf and practiced forming letters. Every afternoon, he copied simple documents under supervision. Every evening, he reviewed his work and corrected his mistakes. Amina watched this process with an interest she struggled to conceal. She found reasons to pass by the room where Faraji studied. She lingered when bringing water or food. She observed the shapes he drew on paper, the way the letters curved and connected, the relationship between the sounds Yusuf spoke and the marks that appeared on the page. Something kindled inside her, a hunger she had not known she possessed. She began to memorize what she saw. At night, in the small space where she slept with the other household servants, she traced invisible letters on the floor with her finger. She repeated sounds to herself in a whisper so quiet that the woman sleeping beside her never stirred. She collected scraps of paper that had been discarded and hid them beneath her sleeping mat. She studied the shapes by the light that came through a crack in the wall. The process was agonizingly slow. She had no teacher. She had no books. She had only observation and memory and a determination that bordered on obsession. Months passed. The rainy season came and went. The monsoon wind shifted from northeast to southwest and back again. Amina ground spices and traced letters and listened to conversations through the wall. By the end of 1826, she could recognize individual Arabic letters. By the spring of 1827, she could sound out simple words. By the summer of that year, she could read complete sentences. She told no one. To reveal her literacy would have been dangerous beyond calculation. Enslaved people who demonstrated unexpected skills were viewed with suspicion. They were considered threats. They disappeared. But Amina had not learned to read for the satisfaction of knowledge alone. She had learned because she understood, in a way that seemed to bypass conscious thought, that the documents Hamad kept in his storage rooms contained information about the trade, about the ships, about the captives, about the entire machinery of suffering that had consumed her own family and delivered her to this island where she ground spices and slept on a mat and was called by a name that was not her own. She had learned to read because she intended to use what she read. Leave a comment below saying never give up on truth if you believe that knowledge should be available to everyone, not just those who hold power over others. The circumstances of Amina's childhood must be understood in their full weight before we can appreciate what she accomplished. She was not born into slavery. She was made into a slave through a series of events that represented the ordinary functioning of an extraordinary system. Her village sat in what is now western Tanzania, in the highlands above Lake Tanganyika. The people there grew millet and kept cattle. They traded with neighboring communities and occasionally with caravans that passed through on their way to the coast. Life was not easy, but it followed patterns that had sustained her people for generations. The raid came in the dry season of 1819, when Amina was approximately 6 years old. She remembered fragments, the sound of gunfire at dawn, her mother's hand pulling her toward the forest, the smell of burning thatch, screams that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The raiders were not strangers. Some of them spoke languages similar to her own. They were African men working for Arab and Swahili traders, paid to capture their neighbors and deliver them to the coast. This was how the majority of enslaved people entered the trade. Not through Europeans sailing up rivers and seizing villagers, as popular imagination sometimes depicted, but through African intermediaries who had been drawn into a system of commerce that valued human beings as currency. Amina's capture began a march that would last nearly 4 months. The captives were linked together by forked wooden poles fastened around their necks, a device called a gori that prevented escape while allowing the column to move. They walked from before dawn until after dark. They ate what the guards provided, usually a handful of grain and whatever water could be found. Those who could not keep pace were killed and left beside the trail. Those who tried to escape were killed as examples to the others. Amina's mother died 3 weeks into the march. She had developed a fever that worsened daily until she could barely stand. One morning, she could not rise. The guards argued briefly about whether to wait. Then one of them drew a knife. Amina saw what followed. She did not look away. She was 6 years old, and she learned in that moment that looking away changed nothing. Her father survived the march, but was separated from her at a market in Tabora, a major trading center in the interior. She watched him being led away by a man in a white robe. He turned once to look back at her. His face held an expression she would spend years trying to interpret. Grief, certainly, but also something else. A charge, a command, as if he were telling her, without words, to remember. She remembered. The next stage of her transport took her to Bagamoyo, the port town on the mainland coast directly across from Zanzibar. The name Bagamoyo means "lay down your heart" in Swahili. It was the last point on the African continent that enslaved people saw before being shipped to the island. They were told to lay down their hearts because they would never return. From Bagamoyo, Amina was loaded onto a dhow, one of the traditional sailing vessels that had carried goods across the Indian Ocean for centuries. The crossing to Zanzibar took only a few hours, but the dhow was packed so tightly that she could not sit down. She stood pressed against other bodies in a hold that stank of vomit and urine and fear. When the dhow reached Stone Town, she was pulled onto the dock and immediately taken to the underground cells where new arrivals were processed. She spent 2 weeks in those cells. The tide rose twice a day. She learned to sleep standing up. She learned to drink salt water when no fresh water was provided. She learned that survival required abandoning the person she had been and becoming something else entirely. When she was finally brought to the market, Hamad bin Mohammed al-Murjebi was not looking for a domestic servant. He was looking for a cook. But the cook he wanted was sick that day and unavailable for inspection. While waiting, he noticed Amina standing in a group of children. Something about her caught his attention. Perhaps it was the way she stood, straight-backed despite everything. Perhaps it was her eyes, which met his directly rather than dropping to the ground. Perhaps it was mere chance, the random intersection of 2 lives that would eventually change history. He purchased her for 60 Maria Teresa thalers, the standard currency of the Indian Ocean trade. It was a modest price, reflecting her age and uncertain potential. He brought her to his household and assigned her to the kitchen. He did not think about her again for years. But Amina thought about him. She thought about all of them. She watched and listened and waited and prepared. And when the moment came, she was ready. The structure of Hamad's household reflected the social hierarchies of Zanzibar society in miniature. At the top sat Hamad himself, the patriarch whose word was law within the compound walls. Below him came his wife, Fatima binti Nasor, who managed the domestic affairs and the servants. Below her came the family's children, 3 sons who were being educated in the ways of trade and religion. Below them came the free servants, Arabs and Swahilis, who were paid wages and could leave if they chose. And at the bottom, in the legal and social sense that defined their existence, came the enslaved. Among the enslaved, there were also gradations. Those who had been in the household longest held informal authority over newer arrivals. Those with specialized skills, like the cook or the groom who tended the family's horses, enjoyed certain privileges denied to others. Those who had earned the family's trust were given responsibilities that brought them closer to the inner workings of the household. Amina had spent 6 years climbing this invisible ladder. She had proven herself reliable. She had never been caught stealing, never been found shirking her duties, never given any reason for punishment. The cook trusted her with the preparation of the most complex dishes. Fatima trusted her with access to the private quarters. Even Hamad, who rarely interacted with the household servants, had come to regard her as a fixture, as unremarkable and essential as the walls themselves. This invisibility was her greatest asset. She moved through the household like a shadow, seeing everything, noticed by no one. She knew when Hamad held meetings with other merchants. She knew which rooms were locked and which were left open. She knew the rhythms of the household, the predictable patterns that created opportunities for someone who knew how to use them. The ledger's existence first came to her attention in the autumn of 1826. She was passing by Hamad's ground floor office, carrying a basket of ground spices to the kitchen, when she heard him speaking with a man she did not recognize. The conversation was in Arabic, which she had only begun to understand. But certain words stood out. Numbers, dates, the names of ships, and a word that appeared again and again. Al-Daftar, the ledger. She slowed her pace. She lingered near the door, pretending to adjust the basket on her hip. The conversation continued. Hamad was explaining something about entries, about reconciling figures, about discrepancies between what was reported to the customs house and what was actually loaded onto ships. The other man was concerned about British inspections. Hamad reassured him. The ledger was safe. The ledger was kept where no one would look. The ledger recorded everything, which was precisely why it had to remain hidden. The conversation ended. Amina moved on, her heart pounding against her ribs. She understood that she had heard something important, even if she did not yet understand exactly what. A hidden ledger, secret records, discrepancies between official reports and actual cargoes. This was the shadow system she had heard hints of through the wall. This was the machinery that operated beneath the visible trade. She began to listen more carefully. She found reasons to pass by the office more frequently. She paid attention to when Hamad worked alone and when he had visitors. She noted which drawers he opened and which he kept locked. She observed where he looked when he was worried, the unconscious glances that revealed what he was thinking about. The ledger, she eventually determined, was kept in a locked cabinet in the corner of Hamad's office. The key to this cabinet hung on a chain around Hamad's neck, along with keys to other locks throughout the household. He never removed the chain, even when sleeping. Access to the ledger seemed impossible, but Amina had learned patience on the march from Lake Tanganyika. She had learned that the impossible was simply the not yet accomplished. She had learned that waiting was itself a form of action. She waited, and the opportunity came. The opportunity arrived in January of 1827, during the festival of Eid al-Adha. The household was in celebration. Hamad had slaughtered a goat in the courtyard, as tradition demanded, and the servants were preparing a feast. Guests would arrive in the evening. Music would play. The children would receive gifts. For one day, The normal hierarchies of the household relaxed slightly, and enslaved servants were given extra food and a few hours of rest. Hamad, in the spirit of celebration, drank more palm wine than was his custom. By late afternoon, he had retired to his bedchamber on the third floor to sleep before the evening's events. Fatima was occupied with the children and the guests. The other servants were scattered throughout the compound, each absorbed in their own tasks. Amina had been watching. She had been counting. She knew that Hamad would sleep for at least 2 hours after drinking heavily. She knew that the office would be empty. She knew that this might be her only chance. She moved through the compound with deliberate casualness, carrying a cloth as if she were going to dust the reception rooms on the second floor. No one questioned her. No one looked twice. She was Amina, the spice grinder, doing what she always did. The office door was not locked during the day. She slipped inside and closed the door behind her. Her hands were trembling. She forced them to be still. The cabinet stood in the corner, its dark wood polished to a gleam. The lock was small but solid. Amina had no key, but she had observed something during her months of watching. Hamad, when he had been drinking, sometimes forgot to fully secure the cabinet. He would turn the key but not check if the lock had engaged. He would assume his actions had been effective because they had always been effective before. She approached the cabinet. She touched the handle. She pulled. The door swung open. Inside, there were stacks of papers, bound documents, rolled scrolls, and account books of various sizes. Amina had no time to examine everything. She had to find the ledger, and she had to do it quickly. She began searching, her fingers moving through the papers with a care that contradicted her racing pulse. Financial records, contracts, correspondence with traders in Muscat. None of this was what she needed. Then, at the bottom of the cabinet, beneath everything else, she found it. A book bound in red leather, larger than the others, its pages thick and heavy. She opened it to the first page and saw columns of Arabic script, numbers arranged in rows, dates and names and figures that spread across the paper in meticulous order. She could not read it all. Her Arabic was still rudimentary, still full of gaps. But she could read enough. She could see the word for slaves. She could see numbers that corresponded to months and years. She could see the names of ships and the names of ports. She could see that this was exactly what she had been looking for. She had perhaps 30 minutes before someone might come looking for her. It was not enough time to read the entire ledger. It was not enough time to memorize its contents. But it was enough time to do something else. She found blank paper in Hamad's desk. She found a pen and ink, and she began to copy. Not everything. That would have been impossible. But the most damning pages. The pages that showed direct shipments to ports where the British were watching. The pages that recorded bribes to customs officials. The pages that named the Sultan's own agents and the percentages they received from each cargo. She copied as quickly as she could, her letters shaky but legible. She made mistakes and did not stop to correct them. She copied until she heard footsteps in the hallway, then gathered the papers, folded them small, and tucked them into her garments. She returned the ledger to its place. She closed the cabinet door. She was out of the office and walking toward the kitchen before the footsteps passed. No one saw her. No one suspected. She had the proof. Now she had to decide what to do with it. The weeks that followed were the most dangerous of Amina's life. She carried the copied pages with her constantly, hidden in different places as circumstances required. She slept with them against her skin. She thought about them during every waking moment. She knew that if they were discovered, her death would be neither quick nor merciful. But she also knew that the pages alone were not enough. She was an enslaved woman with no legal standing, no social position, no credibility in the eyes of those who held power. If she simply walked into the British consulate and handed over her evidence, she would be dismissed as a thief, a liar, a troublemaker. Her papers would be confiscated and destroyed. Hamad would be warned, and she would vanish into the same darkness that had swallowed countless others before her. She needed intermediaries. She needed a chain of people who could carry the information from her hands to ears that would listen. She needed to build a network. The foundation of this network was already in place, though she had not consciously built it. Over her years in the household, Amina had formed relationships with other enslaved people in the neighborhood. They met at the wells where water was drawn, in the markets where supplies were purchased, in the narrow streets where servants ran errands for their masters. They exchanged information, small kindnesses, and the kind of solidarity that develops among people who share a common condition. Among these acquaintances was a woman named Zuhura, who worked in the household of an Indian merchant named Vishram Lakha. Vishram was not involved in the slave trade. His business was textiles, imported from Bombay and sold throughout East Africa. He had no love for the Arab traders who dominated Zanzibar's commerce, and he had connections with the British community through his role as a supplier to the British consulate. Amina approached Zuhura carefully over the course of several weeks. She did not reveal her full purpose at first. She asked questions about Vishram's business, his relationships, his reputation. She learned that he was known as an honest man, unusual in a place where honesty was often a disadvantage. She learned that he had spoken critically of the slave trade in private, though he was careful never to do so in public. She learned that he might be willing to help if the cause were just and the risks manageable. The conversation that changed everything took place in a quiet corner of the fish market in late February of 1827. Zuhura had agreed to arrange a meeting with Vishram, though she did not know why Amina wanted to meet him. The Indian merchant arrived wearing a simple cotton robe, his manner suggesting that he was accustomed to discretion. Amina showed him the papers. She explained what they were and where they had come from. She watched his face as he read, watched the expressions that moved across his features. Disbelief, then horror, then something that looked like determination. When he finished reading, he looked at her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Do you understand what you have done?" he asked. "I have found the truth," she said. "I have written it down. Now I need someone to carry it further than I can carry it myself." Vishram was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I know someone," he said. "A British naval officer. He has been trying to prove that the Sultan's treaties are being violated. He has suspected what you have documented, but he has never had evidence. This will give him what he needs." "And what will happen to me?" Amina asked. Vishram did not answer immediately. He understood what she was really asking. She was asking whether her life would be sacrificed for the sake of this information. She was asking whether her survival was part of the plan, or merely a hopeful possibility. "I cannot promise your safety," he finally said. "I can only promise that your evidence will be used, that it will matter, that the people whose names are written in this ledger will face consequences." It was not the reassurance Amina wanted, but it was honest. And honesty, she had learned, was more valuable than false comfort. She gave him the papers. She watched them disappear into his robe, and then she walked back to the household of Hamad bin Mohammed al-Murjabi to grind spices and fetch water and pretend that nothing had changed. The British naval officer to whom Vishram delivered the papers was a man named Captain Thomas Elwin, who commanded HMS Jasper, a small warship assigned to anti-slavery patrols in the Indian Ocean. Elwin had spent 3 years chasing dhows along the coast, freeing the captives he caught, and watching with growing frustration as the trade continued despite all his efforts. The problem was not the trade itself. The problem was the duplicity of the Sultan's government, which publicly cooperated with British efforts while privately facilitating the very commerce it had promised to suppress. Elwin had suspected this duplicity for years, but he had never been able to prove it. His superiors in Bombay wanted evidence, not suspicions. They wanted documents, not accusations. Without proof, there was nothing to be done. The papers that Vishram delivered provided that proof. Elwan read them in his cabin aboard the Jasper, anchored in Zanzibar's harbor, and felt a mixture of vindication and rage. Here were the names of officials who had lied to his face. Here were the records of shipments that had sailed past his patrols because they had been warned in advance. Here was the evidence of corruption reaching to the highest levels of the Sultan's government. But Elwin was also a practical man. He understood that the papers, on their own, might not be enough. They could be dismissed as forgeries. They could be attributed to a disgruntled servant seeking revenge. They needed corroboration. They needed context. They needed additional testimony from people who could confirm what the documents described. He sent a message to Vishram, asking for more. Vishram relayed the request to Zuhura, who conveyed it to Amina. And Amina, understanding what was being asked, began the most dangerous phase of her campaign. She began to recruit others. The recruitment was slow and careful. She identified enslaved people in households throughout Stone Town who had access to information about the trade. She approached them in the same gradual way she had approached Zuhura, building trust over weeks before revealing her purpose. She found a cook who worked for a ship captain involved in the shadow trade. She found a groom who overheard conversations between merchants at the coffee houses. She found a porter who loaded cargo onto dhows and knew exactly what was being shipped and when. Each of these people took an enormous risk by sharing what they knew. Each understood that discovery would mean death, but each also shared something with Amina, a desire to see the system that had consumed their lives exposed and, if possible, destroyed. The information flowed upward through the network, from the enslaved to Amina, from Amina to Zuhura, from Zuhura to Vishram, from Vishram to Captain Elwan. Each link in the chain added something to the picture: schedules of shipments, names of complicit officials, routes taken to avoid British patrols. The network assembled a portrait of the shadow trade that was far more detailed than anything the British had possessed before. And then, in June of 1827, Elwan acted. The first seizure occurred at night, 3 miles off the coast of Zanzibar. The dhow was called the Fatah al-Khair, and it carried 87 enslaved people bound for the Arabian Peninsula. Captain Elwan had been informed of its departure time, its route, and its cargo by sources who traced back, through the network, to Amina's original discovery. The Jasper intercepted the dhow before dawn. The crew offered no resistance. They had been told that the British would not be patrolling this route, that the way was clear. They were wrong. The information they had been given was false, planted by the network to ensure the interception would succeed. The captives were freed and taken to a liberated African settlement in Bombay. The crew of the dhow was arrested, and in the pockets of the captain, the British found documents that matched the format and handwriting of the papers Amina had copied months before. The match was crucial. It established that the ledger existed. It proved that the British were not operating on fabricated evidence. It gave Elwan the leverage he needed to demand action from his superiors. A second seizure followed in July, a third in August. By September, the British had freed over 400 enslaved people and captured 5 ships connected to the shadow trade. The official figures reported to the Sultan showed no unusual activity. The discrepancy was now undeniable. In London, the evidence was presented to Parliament. Questions were raised about the effectiveness of treaties that were being openly violated. Pressure mounted on the Foreign Office to take a harder line with the Sultan. Newspapers published accounts of the seizures, describing the conditions in which the captives had been found, and the duplicity of those who had promised to end such practices. The Sultan, faced with undeniable evidence of violations conducted by members of his own government, was forced to respond. He dismissed several officials named in the captured documents. He agreed to new inspection procedures that gave British officers greater authority. He issued public statements condemning the shadow trade that he had privately facilitated for years. None of this ended the slave trade in Zanzibar. The commerce was too profitable, too deeply embedded in the economy of the region, to be dismantled by a few seizures and some public embarrassments. The trade would continue for decades more, gradually declining as British pressure increased and alternative economic systems developed. But something had changed. The system that had operated in complete impunity was now under scrutiny. The officials who had grown wealthy from bribes now had to be more careful. The ships that had sailed freely now faced real risk of interception. The shadow was a little less dark than it had been before, and at the center of this change, unknown to almost everyone involved, was a woman who had learned to read in secret and had decided that the truth deserved to be known. But Amina's role did not remain secret for long. Networks, by their nature, leave traces. People talk. connections are noticed. By the autumn of 1827, rumors were circulating in Stone Town about a source inside the trading houses, someone who had access to documents that should have been secure. Hamid bin Mohammed al-Morjebi began to suspect his household. He reviewed who had access to his office, who had been near the cabinet, who might have had the opportunity to copy his records. He questioned servants. He examined schedules. He paid closer attention to movements and behaviors that he had previously ignored. Amina sensed the danger shifting toward her. She noticed Hamad watching her with new intensity. She noticed that the other household servants treated her differently, as if they too suspected something. The walls were closing in. She had prepared for this possibility. In the months since copying the ledger, she had taken steps to protect herself. She had established contact with Captain Elwyn through the network, and Elwyn had agreed that if her identity was discovered, he would do what he could to extract her from Zanzibar. It was not a guarantee of safety, but it was something. The moment of crisis came in October. Hamad summoned all household servants to the courtyard. He announced that a theft had occurred, that documents had been taken from his office, that he intended to discover who was responsible. He said that he would question each servant individually. He said that those who confessed would be treated with mercy. He did not specify what would happen to those who did not. The questioning began with the male servants. Amina listened from the kitchen as voices rose and fell in Hamad's office. She heard denials, protests, pleading. She heard a sound that might have been a blow. She understood that her time was running out. That night, she made her decision. She could not wait for Hamad to reach her in the questioning. She could not trust that she would be able to maintain her composure, that she would be able to lie convincingly enough to avoid suspicion. She had to leave. The escape route had been planned weeks earlier. Vishram had arranged for a small boat to be available at a cove outside Stone Town, manned by fishermen who owed him favors. From the cove, the boat would take Amina to a British ship patrolling offshore. From there, she would be transported to Bombay to the settlement where freed slaves began new lives. Getting out of the household was the difficult part. The compound was locked at night. Guards watched the doors. Movement after dark attracted attention, but Amina had spent 6 years mapping the compound's vulnerabilities. She knew that the wall on the eastern side, where the kitchen backed against a narrow alley, had crumbled slightly during the last rainy season. The damage had been repaired, but the repair was less solid than the original construction. She had tested it, pushing against the stones when no one was watching, feeling them shift under her hands. She waited until the household was asleep. She gathered the few possessions she intended to take: a small knife, a piece of cloth, and a single page from the ledger that she had kept hidden, proof of what she had done, if proof were ever needed. She moved through the darkness of the kitchen, navigating by memory rather than sight. The wall section gave way more easily than she expected. She pushed through the gap into the alley, scraping her arms on the rough coral stones. Blood ran down her skin. She did not stop to examine the wounds. The streets of Stone Town at night were not empty. There were patrols, sailors from the ships in harbor, servants running late errands. Amina kept to shadows, moved when the way was clear, froze when footsteps approached. She had never been in the streets at this hour. Everything looked different in the darkness. The familiar buildings transformed into threatening shapes. The cove was 2 miles from the compound. She reached it just as the first gray light appeared on the eastern horizon. The boat was there, as Vishram had promised. 2 fishermen waited beside it, their faces invisible in the pre-dawn gloom. They asked no questions. They helped her into the boat and pushed off from the shore. The British ship was anchored 5 miles out, beyond the sight of watchmen on the shore. The journey across the water was the longest of Amina's life. Every moment, she expected to hear shouts from behind, to see pursuit boats launching from the harbor. But the sea remained quiet. The sunrise turned the water gold and pink, and then the British ship appeared, its masts rising against the brightening sky, and Amina knew that she would survive. The story of what happened next comes to us through multiple sources, some reliable, some less so. What we know with certainty is that Amina reached Bombay in November of 1827 and was placed in a settlement called Nasik, established by the Church Missionary Society for freed slaves. She was given a new name by the missionaries, a Christian name, and she was taught to read and write in English as well as Arabic. But her African name, her real name, she never forgot. She called herself Nyamwiza when speaking to other freed Africans in the settlement, the one who brings light. The name her mother had given her, the name she had carried inside herself through all the years of darkness. Captain Elwan's reports made their way to London, where they were compiled into a document that influenced parliamentary debates on slavery for years afterward. The document did not mention Amina by name. It referred only to intelligence received from sources within the Zanzibar trading houses. But those who knew the full story understood that behind the anonymous phrase stood a woman whose courage had made the intelligence possible. Hamad bin Mohammed al-Murjabi continued his business for several years after Amina's escape, though with greater caution and reduced profits. He died in 1834, apparently of natural causes, though rumors persisted that his death was connected to disputes with other merchants who blamed him for the increased British attention on the shadow trade. His household was dispersed. The House of Secrets passed through multiple owners. Eventually it fell into disrepair and was abandoned. Sultan Sayyid Said maintained his position until his death in 1856, navigating the increasing pressure from Britain while preserving as much of the trade as he could. His successors faced even greater pressure, and in 1873, under the threat of a British naval blockade, the slave market in Stonetown was officially closed. A church now stands on the site where human beings were once sold. The altar is positioned at the exact location where the whipping post stood, where enslaved people were beaten to demonstrate their strength to potential buyers. Vishram Lakha prospered in the textile trade and lived to an old age. He never spoke publicly about his role in the network, but he maintained correspondence with Captain Elwan for decades and funded the education of several freed slaves in Bombay. Among the students he supported was a young man named Faraji, the copyist whose literacy training had inadvertently taught Amina to read. Faraji had escaped Hamad's household in the confusion following Amina's flight. He made his way to the coast and eventually to Bombay, where he reconnected with the woman whose observation of his lessons had sparked a revolution. They lived in the same settlement for 3 years, before Faraji moved to a mission in Kenya. They maintained correspondence until his death in 1871. The letters between them have survived. They discuss memories of Zanzibar, the challenges of their new lives, the news from East Africa that reached them through missionary networks. They discuss faith, doubt, regret, and hope. They discuss what it means to have been part of something larger than themselves. And in one letter, dated March of 1869, Amina wrote something that has been quoted by historians ever since. "I did not know, when I first traced letters in the dust, that I was preparing a weapon. I thought I was only learning, but learning is always a weapon, when it is placed in the hands of those who are meant to remain ignorant. They built their world on our ignorance. When we broke that ignorance, their world began to crack. If you watched until this point, it is because you care about stories that matter, stories that remind us what ordinary people can accomplish when they refuse to accept the roles assigned to them. Leave a comment saying, 'I watched until here,' so I can know who you are who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Amina's story touched your heart. Share it so that her memory will never be forgotten. But there is one more chapter to this story, a chapter that is still being written. In 1998, a team of archaeologists excavating the ruins of a merchant house in Stonetown discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floor of what had been an office. Inside the compartment, they found the remains of documents that had been partially burned but not destroyed. Among these documents was a leather-bound book with red covers, its pages damaged but still legible in places. It was a ledger. It recorded shipments of enslaved people from Zanzibar to ports throughout the Indian Ocean. It included names, dates, prices, and destinations. It matched, in format and content, the descriptions of the hidden ledger that appeared in Captain Elwan's reports from 1827. The discovery sparked intense debate among historians. Some argued that this was the very ledger that Amina had discovered, somehow preserved despite the decades. Others argued that it was a different document, perhaps a copy or a later version. The leather binding suggested mid-19th century construction, which made direct connection to Amina's discovery possible, but not certain. What is certain is that the ledger, whatever its exact provenance, provides documentary evidence of the shadow trade that Amina exposed. It confirms the existence of the system she described. It validates the intelligence that Captain L1 received. It stands as physical proof that her story was true. The ledger is now held in the archives of the Zanzibar National Museum in the stone town that Amina walked through almost 2 centuries ago. Visitors can view it by special request. Most do not know its significance. Most do not know about the woman who first brought its existence to light. But some do know, and they come to stand before the glass case that protects the ledger. And they think about what it took to expose what was written inside. They think about the courage required to learn forbidden knowledge. They think about the networks of trust that carried dangerous truth from those who possessed it to those who could act on it. They think about the price that was paid and the difference that was made. And sometimes, if you watch closely, you will see them touch the glass gently, as if reaching across time to thank someone they never met. The woman who learned to read in secret. The woman who brought light. Nyamwiza. In the oral traditions of coastal Tanzania, there is a story that mothers tell their daughters. It speaks of a woman who could read the wind, who knew what the merchants were thinking before they spoke, who walked out of a rich man's house and was never captured again. The story says that she lives still, in the space between the written word and the spoken, in the crack between what power says and what power does. The story says that when an enslaved person learns to read, Nyamwiza smiles. The historical record is more prosaic. It tells us that Amina binti Salam, also known as Nyamwiza, lived in the Nasik settlement until 1842, when she moved to a village near Mombasa. She married a freed slave named Hamisi and had 4 children. She taught all of them to read, in Arabic and in English and in Swahili. She worked as a translator for missionary societies, helping to communicate between Europeans and the African communities they sought to convert. She died in 1879, approximately 65 years old, and was buried in a cemetery that has since been absorbed by urban development. Her grave is lost. No photograph of her exists. We do not know what she looked like, what her voice sounded like, how she moved through the world. We know only what she did and what she left behind. What she left behind was a crack in the system, a fracture in the edifice of impunity that had protected the traders and the officials and the Sultan himself. The trade continued after her, yes, but it continued under scrutiny, under pressure, under the knowledge that someone, somewhere, might be watching, might be reading, might be copying the secrets that were supposed to remain hidden. She showed that the system was not invulnerable. She showed that its foundations were not as solid as they appeared. She showed that information, in the right hands, could be more powerful than chains. These are lessons that resonate beyond their historical moment. They remind us that resistance takes many forms. They remind us that knowledge once acquired cannot be unacquired. They remind us that the powerful are powerful only as long as their secrets remain secret. Amina binti Salam could not end the slave trade. She was one woman with limited resources, operating under conditions of extreme danger. But she could weaken it. She could expose it. She could make it harder for those who profited from human suffering to operate in total darkness. And in doing so, she joined a tradition that stretches back to the beginning of human history and continues to this day. The tradition of those who speak when silence is demanded. The tradition of those who record when forgetting is enforced. The tradition of those who bring light into places that power wants to keep dark. This is the tradition of the witness. This is the tradition of the truth-teller. This is the tradition that Amina embodied and that continues in everyone who chooses to see what they are supposed to ignore and to speak what they are supposed to keep silent. Her name was Nyamwiza. She brought light, and the light has not gone out. The ruins still stand on the eastern shore of Zanzibar. The coral walls have crumbled further. The frangipani trees have grown larger. The lizards that sun themselves on the stones are the descendants of lizards that watched Amina walk through these rooms almost 200 years ago. Visitors come occasionally. Most are tourists who have wandered off the main paths looking for something they cannot quite name. They stand among the ruins and feel something, a heaviness in the air, a sense that the stones remember what happened here. Some of them ask their guides about the history of the building. Most guides do not know. They speak in general terms about the old merchant houses of Zanzibar, about the trade in cloves and ivory and other goods. They do not mention the trade in human beings. They do not mention the ledger. They do not mention Amina. But occasionally, a guide will pause. Will look at the visitor with an assessing eye. Will decide that this particular person deserves to know the full story. There was a woman, the guide will say. She worked in this house a long time ago. She was not supposed to know how to read, but she learned, and she found something, a book of secrets, a record of things that were supposed to stay hidden. She copied what she found. She gave it to people who could use it. And because of what she did, the British knew things they were not supposed to know, and they caught ships they were not supposed to catch, and they freed people who were supposed to remain enslaved. The visitor will listen. We'll look around at the ruins with new understanding. We'll try to imagine what it was like to live here, to work here, to learn forbidden knowledge in secret, and then to risk everything by using it. What happened to her? The visitor will ask. She escaped, the guide will say. She got out before they could catch her. She lived a long life. She had children. She taught them to read. And then the guide will smile, a smile that contains something deeper than tourism, something that connects the past to the present in ways that cannot be spoken directly. Her name, the guide will say, was Nyamwiza. It means, the one who brings light. And they say that when you learn to read something you are not supposed to read, she is watching. She is smiling, because every secret that is exposed is a victory. And every victory, no matter how small, matters. The visitor will leave the ruins with something they did not have before. A story, a name, a reason to believe that one person's courage can make a difference, even against systems that seem too powerful to challenge. This is how memory works, not through monuments and official histories alone, but through stories passed from mouth to ear, from guide to visitor, from mother to daughter. This is how Amina lives on, almost 2 centuries after she walked these streets. This is how any of us might live on, if we have the courage to do something worth remembering.